Like some fabulous gifts. Those are very exciting giving opportunities. Very cool, very innovative. Okay, so we're approaching our final session today. Ari is right. These 4 stories that I chose that we've been doing over these past few sessions, I didn't actually specify that there was a theme of power and powerlessness, because that wasn't actually the theme. The theme was really, I'm picking some of my favorite stories from different Massechets, from different tractates that I think are really great. But I think over the past year and a half, something that I've been thinking about a lot, and with the pandemic, is this theme of just power and powerlessness has just been on my mind very much, and has made its way into a lot of my teaching, a year in which for so many of us felt powerless for different reasons. Of where are the places, what do we do with those feelings of powerlessness? Where in our lives do we find power? What are our obligations around power? So while that wasn't a formal theme, once I actually went back over and looked at the text that I chose, I did see, in a sense, that theme of power and powerlessness also making its way through some of our learning, as we've seen in the stories that we've seen together, stories about who has power, who is powerful in prayer, and this week we're moving on to, last week looking at the sort of the balance between power, owning our power, stepping into our power when we are the ones that have to make a decision, and also that balance with humility of stepping back, of how to know how to handle that. This final session, we're really going to be looking at some really beautiful and I think powerful, I mean that in a different sense here, really beautiful and moving stories around giving and tzedakah. But on the surface of it, again, don't really have anything to do with power, except I think that they are about power, because ultimately it's about thinking about the role of the giver and the power we have in deciding to whom to give tzedakah, when to give, how much to give, that there's a real power that we have in making those decisions about when are we going to open our wallet, when are we going to open our homes, and that sort of evaluation that happens when you're either here, you're walking by someone that seems to be in need, or you hear about an organization that needs, that ultimately we go through sort of an inner calculus of, well, is this worthy? Is this person worthy? How worthy are they? How much do I want to give? And so those are some of the questions we're going to think about today. I would say the questions that are on my mind for the text today are, who decides who is deserving of tzedakah? Who decides who is deserving of tzedakah? And are there people who aren't deserving of charity? A second question, is there a limit to how much we should give? Do we give as much as we can, as much as we want, or is there some sort of limit? And the third, how do we decide to whom to give and how much to give? How do we make those decisions ourselves when, there is so much need in the world and so many sort of infinite demands on our tzedakah, so to speak? So how do we begin to make those decisions about whom to give, how to prioritize, and how much? We're going to be looking at these questions not by turning to the halakha, not by turning to Jewish law in which the rabbis tell us what to do, but actually by turning to the stories themselves in which the rabbis are wrestling with it, in which the rabbis find themselves with someone before them in need, someone before them asking for money, asking for food, and the rabbis are trying to decide on the spot, well, should I feed this person or not? Should I feed this person? Is this person worthy or are they not worthy? And we'll see that sometimes the rabbis get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. But I think the point is, and this is always the point I think in learning stories, their stories are a window into their own struggles, into their processes, and they also just reflect back our own, that we're not the first ones to be, when someone approaches you on the street and in that moment you're deciding, should I give or should I not give, that the rabbis also thought about those things. So I think Ari dropped the source sheet already into the chat. I'm going to go ahead and screen share. We're actually going to start off not with the Gemara yet today. I want to hold on to that for a second. I want to start the first piece of Gemara we're going to look at is really going to make close reading of some verses from the Torah. So I want to start today with the Torah to make sure that we have a good handle on those verses. The question there, I would say that I want you to be thinking about as we're reading together the text from the Torah is, if this is the Torah, if this is what the Torah is teaching us about tzedakah and giving, what is our obligation? To whom do we have to give? And how much do we have to give? So first we'll read that section from the Torah, and then we'll actually move on to the Talmud. So go ahead and screen share. Let's make this a bit bigger. So this comes from the book of Devarim. So we're getting there in the year. This is one of my favorite sections. It has within it an internal contradiction in which it says one thing and then it's something else, and it seems to be directly contradicting. So watch out for that. See if you can catch what is the part that seems, what are the two verses, the two lines that are directly contradicting? Because I'm going to ask you about that after we're done reading. Efes ki lo yebecha evyon, ki yivarechecha Hashem, ba'aretz asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha nachala l'rishta. So there shall be no needy among you, because the Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion. Here is a promise. Efes ki lo yebecha evyon. There will be no needy. Once we get into this promised land, we're not there yet. We're still in the book of Devarim. Once we cross over, once we get into the promised land, we get this promise from God that there will be no needy. There will be no poverty. What an amazing sort of messianic world we would be in. And then it goes on to say, what's the condition? Rak im shamoa tishma'u b'kol Hashem Elokecha. That will only be true, that there will be no needy, if we will listen to the voice of God, if we will take care to observe all of the mitzvot that God is commanding us today. It goes on, what are these mitzvot? For the Lord your God will bless you as God has promised you. You will extend loans to many nations, but require none yourself. You will dominate many nations, but they will not dominate you. Again, this continued promise, if we just follow all the commandments that we're being commanded to keep, then not only will there be no needy in the promised land, we will also, we will extend loans. We will be in a position of generosity. We'll be in a position of power, but no one else will have power over us. We will not actually require that loan, that charity ourselves. And it goes on, if, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen in any of your settlements in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. I'm going to read this in the Hebrew because this verse is going to be the verse that's really subject to the Gemara that we're going to see next. Ki patoach tiftach et yadcha lo. You shall surely open your hand to him. Just noticing the repetition in the Hebrew, you can just hear the word here, patoach, tiftach, that word means open, and you have it repeated twice for emphasis. Ki patoach tiftach et yadcha lo. You should really, surely, certainly open your hand. Don't harden your hand, don't close it. You should open your hand to him. V'ha'avet ta'avitenu dai mechasoro asher yechsar lo. And that you shall surely lend him all that he needs, all that is lacking to him. The English is interesting. It says, lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. I would say it's a little bit more complicated in the Hebrew here, that the ha'avet ta'avitenu, this is the loan, enough for that which is enough for his deficiency, for all that is deficient to him. Okay, so what is our obligation here? If you see someone in need, if there is someone in need, don't shut your hand, don't harden your heart. Surely really open your hand, lend him enough for what is deficient, that which is lacking to him. Okay, we'll keep going on. Beware lest you harbor the base thought and you say the seventh year, the year of remission is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. What's this verse talking about? It's talking about that in the seventh year, every year, there's the Shemitah year. That's the year that any debt that anyone owes gets released and you no longer owe them that debt. So say, for example, Ari loans me $500 in year 6. If I don't get around to paying it by year 7, that debt is canceled out and I no longer own Ari money. Whereas if Ari loans me money in year 1 or year 2, Ari's like, well, I still have 5 or 6 years to get my money back. I'm pretty confident that I was going to pay me back by then. But the closer you get to the Shemitah year, the canceling of the debts, the closer you get to year 7, the more likely it is that the person who's in the position of power, the giver, is going to say, well, I don't know if I'm going to get that money back. There's only 6 months till Shemitah. That's not a good loan. That's not a secure loan. But the Torah knows us. The Torah knows that in year 5, year 6, we're going to start thinking, I don't know if this loan is a good idea. So it warns us. It says, beware lest you harbor that thought and you say the 7th year is approaching and I'm not going to give. and I'm mean to my needy kinsman and I give him nothing, he will cry out to the Lord against you and you will incur guilt. Give to him readily and have no regrets when you do so. This is a really hard thing that we're being asked to do, that in year 6, when you're really not sure for good reason if your giving is going to come back to you, you think you're loaning someone money, but you don't know if it's a loan, you don't know if you're going to get it back, that the Torah is commanding us, even if you don't know if you're going to get that money back, you still have to give, and you have to give without regrets. You actually have to find a way to feel good about that giving, when in a situation in which the giving is uncertain. For in return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and in all your undertakings. Ki lo yechdal evyon mikerev haaretz, because the poor will never cease from the land. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, patoach tiftach et yadcha, that you should surely open your hand to your brother, to the poor person, and to your needy kinsman in the land. So again, normally they say about the Torah that the Torah is pretty sparse with words. So when the Torah repeats something, you have to ask the question, ooh, why is the Torah repeating it, right? If the Torah says, Batoach tiftach et yadcha, surely open your hand, you have the repetition of the word open, and so it's there for emphasis. This whole phrase is repeated twice in this section within the span of 5 verses. The Torah commands us, Batoach tiftach et yadcha. So there's a question there of, why did we need to be commanded twice? Why did we need to have the exact same verse twice within the span of such short verses? And again, just I want to emphasize here, we began with, Efes ki lo yelecha becha evyon, there shall be no needy among you. And we're ending with, ki lo yechdal evyon mikerev haaretz, for there will never cease to be needy ones in your land. Okay, let me pause there. I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the chat. What is the contradiction that you see here in this section? And can you make sense of the contradiction? Can you reconcile? Is it a contradiction that we can reconcile, or is it a contradiction that just we can't make any sense of? That's the first question. And the second question is, if this is the text that's really a fundamental key text on giving in the Torah, what is this text trying to tell us? What is it teaching us? What should we take from it? So go ahead and put that in chat. Okay, so Arnold says, we need to help our kinsmen. So that's probably Arnold translating from achicha, your fellow, your kinsman, but not your neighbor who is not your kinsman. So that's very interesting. So Arnold is pointing out, is the text saying that we have more of a commitment to the person who is achicha, our brother, and who qualifies as that? But does that mean that our obligation to people that are outside of achicha is less strong? Arnold, I was also wondering about that. It's a little bit more expansive in verse 11, right? Because you have open your hand to achicha, le'aniyecha, ule'evyonecha. There's sort of a repetition or redundancy there. What are those 3 words? Your kinsman, the poor person, and the needy person. And so I wonder, Arnold, if there's an opportunity in that sort of redundancy there of those 3 categories to say, well, maybe the achicha is your kinsman, and aniyecha and evyonecha, those poor people are sort of more expansive. But Arnold, I think that you're right to ask that question of, are there spheres of obligation that the Torah is saying, well, really it's your kinsman, and then we'll see about the other people. Okay, going back to your comments. So Rosa says, perhaps God knew that not everyone will follow the commandments, and that's why God's promise of no poor doesn't come through. Good, Rosa. So that's beautiful. Let me also just read this next one. There is the ideal no needy and the reality that needy exist. Good. So very good. Right. Heather says, first is an ideal world. The ideal world is that world that we're striving for. That's the promise from God. There will be no needy. But then we recognize the world in which things are not equal. There's something very powerful for that, I think. On one hand, it's a promise that doesn't ring true, that God promises there will never cease to be needy. But it's God putting out front, this is the world we're striving for, people. This is, I don't know if it's possible, but this is the ideal. And let's not forget that this is the world that we want to be in. We want to be in the world where no one is dependent upon each other, where there are no needy. And then it's also, the Torah is then immediately recognizing, but we're not yet in that moment. And as long as we're not in that moment, well, then what do we need to do? What are our obligations to each other of simultaneously holding both of those worlds together. For me to feel something powerful, another way I like to think about this is if you only had one of those verses, like why do you need both of those verses? If you only had, there will be no needy, then we would think, oh, God's going to take care of all. Either we're going to think we're already there, which we all know we're not there, or we're going to think this is God's responsibility. God's going to take care of it. God's going to take care of it all. God's going to make sure there's no needy. And so we need the needy will never cease, so that we realize, oh, we're actually partners in this and we have an obligation. And if we only had the last verse, there will never cease to be needy from the land. If we're too in the reality of the world we are in, that there actually is so much need and poverty, then we might become so paralyzed or overwhelmed by the amount of need and the fact that the needy will never cease from the land, that we would throw our hands up and say, I can't do it. It's too much for me. It's beyond me. And so I'm not doing anything. And so we need the pairing of the ideal world with the real world to have the ideal world to be the thing that we're striving for, but the real world to keep us grounded in there's still work to be done and we have a role in it.
I chatted this, but I'll bring it up too, because I know we have people who are Bible scholars on the line. I've read parts of Torah that are confusing. This section is completely needs editing. I mean, it is so repetitive. I don't mind repetition and poetry within a pasuk, but the pasukim is so repetitious. It just seems that they are from different authors, kind of smushed in together. They generally say the same thing, but it just seems very much unnecessary. If you want to argue that every word in the Torah is important,
yeah,
I'm very interested to see where we go with this.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Ari. I think anytime in the Torah that you have things that either feel contradictory or redundant, or psukim that feel like they're saying the same thing. Didn't I just have the 6? There was a section that I was just reading that was just so entirely repetitive. I think that's fair. I think multiple authorship of the Torah and sort of the different redactors and editing, I think that's one answer. And I think that's totally fair. I'm not denying that. I guess I would also say in this section, though, it's not hard for me to find meaning, for me to explain the redundancy and say, why did we need the patoach tiftach, the surely open? Why did we need that phrase to appear twice, the patoach tiftach et yadecha, you should surely open? Is because this is something that is so hard for us and so sort of counter our impulse. I think that for me, feels something, I don't know, very real, that the Torah knows our human basis instincts and knows that in year 6, we're not going to want to lend the money. And so we need to be told once, twice, 3 times. We actually need that repetition in this section, because otherwise we're just going to say, we're going to give into our impulse, which is maybe not to give, or to say, well, there's never going to cease to be needy. So I can't do it. I'm not going to take my part. So I think, Ari, you're totally right. That could be an answer. And also I like holding the other answer of, I think part of the repetition here is recognizing just how hard it might be. Okay, good. So Beverly says very clearly, and I think, Beverly, you're right. If you listen to the deity and lend and give money to the poor, then there would no longer be any poor person in your community, right? It's not just if you follow the mitzvot, but if you actually follow the mitzvot of making sure you're lending, if you follow that, then there wouldn't be any poverty. And it's the fact that people aren't doing that we're still in the reality, we're still in the last verse of, well, as long as you're not doing that, then the needy will never cease. Beautiful. Rita says something similar. Thank you. Okay. Good. So lots of really great comments. Lots of really great comments. And I do just want to hit Neil's comment at the end. Neil says, loans are not really charity. That is interesting. That's an interesting thing to point out. That this section actually is not, in a sense, it's not really about tzedakah and giving in sort of the purest sense, that there are other sections that talk about that. There are other mitzvot in the Torah. For example, the mitzvah of leaving the corners of your field uncut. That's giving, that it's pure giving. I'm not getting anything out of it. Or leaving behind the fallen sheaves for people to get. That's pure giving. Tithing, giving 10% of your income, that's pure giving. This is a section that really, this is talking about loans. This is talking about, I'm still hoping to get the money back. Again, perhaps in year 6, I'm not so sure. And that's why the Torah is saying, well, you have to make sure to lend anyway. But Neil, I think that's a good point, that this is a different type of sort of social net to support people. Okay, let's go on. Thank you for all of those thoughts there in the chat. Keeping in mind sort of this balance between there shall never cease to be, there will be no needy, and there shall never cease to be needy, thinking about our obligation. And again, I just want to read you this verse, because this is the verse we're really going to be focusing on. You shall surely open your hand, and lend lo, dai machsoro, enough for that which is deficient, asher yechsarlo, that which is deficient to him. Okay, that's going to be the verse we're going to read. So we're going on to, all of our texts today are going to come from Massekhet Ketubot, the tractate on Ketubot, which you might be familiar with the word ketubah from wedding document. Well, actually, this first text does have a little bit to do with marriage, surprisingly. But as for the course, normally if you pull a random aggadah or random story out of the Gemara, it might have nothing to do with the name of its tractate, because the Gemara is so train of thought. So while this whole tractate is about marriages and weddings, the sections we're looking at are very much a series of stories, a series of aggadot on tzedakah and giving. So Tanu Rabbanan, we learn from the sages, we learn from the rabbis concerning an orphan boy who has come to marry, so he has no parents. The charities rent a house for him, arrange for him a bed and all his utensils, and thereafter they marry him a wife. These are the things that the charities have to do in the place of living parents. As it's stated, how do we know that they're obligated to do this? Quoting our verse, Dai machsaro asher yichaserlo. This is actually poorly punctuated. So how do we know that the charities have to step in for this poor orphan that doesn't have parents? Because we learn you have to provide them with everything that they are lacking. And so then they're going to do a close reading. They say, well, what about there's even some repetition even in this, right? Dai machsoro asher yichaserlo. Enough for that which is lacking. You could have just stopped there. They have to provide him with enough for that which is lacking. But the verse continues, that which is lacking to him, that there's a sort of repetition in that verse there. So they say, they sort of read interpretively, they say, well, what's dai machsaro, enough for his deficiency? This is referring to the house that they have to provide. Asher yechaser, for that which is lacking. This is referring to they have to provide him with a bed and a table. And the word lo specifically to him, that which is lacking to him, this is referring to the wife that they have to sort of provide to him. How do we know this? We know this from Genesis, Eseh lo ezer kenigdo, that God says, I will make him, Adam, a helper mate that is corresponding or fitting to him. Just as the lo there to Adam is talking about providing him with a wife, so too the lo in our verse. But the point is to say they do a close reading of our verse, Dai machsoro asher yichaserlo, to say these are all the things that the charity has to step in and provide for someone, all the places in which they're deficient. But then they go on and say, but wait a second, how much do we have to provide? Okay, so we said a house, we said the table and the bed, we said a wife. Are there more things we have to provide? So they say concerning this issue, the sages taught, Dai machsoro, quoting again, sufficient for his deficiency. This teaches that you are commanded with respect to the one in need to support him, but you are not commanded with respect to him to make him wealthy, which is to say, it's like if here's the level we want everyone to be, and this poor guy is deficient in something, right? He's below the poverty line. He's over here. You have to raise him enough to get him away from that deficiency, but just to here, you don't have to raise him up to make him wealthy. Okay, that there's a limit to how much we need to give just to cover the deficiency. So you're commanded to support him. You are not commanded to make him wealthy. However, the verse also states, which is deficient for him. So in there, the Hebrew is asher yechaser lo. The key word here is going to be not just, it could have just been enough for his deficiency. It could have been enough for his deficiency, which is deficient, but they add in the words lo. What is the, to him, what is the meaning we're going to make out of specifically his deficiency, his unique deficiency? So they say, they read interpretively, they say, well, how do we understand the lo, which is deficient for him? This includes even a horse upon which to ride and a servant to run in front of him. If there is a person who fell from a greater status of wealth, who in his times had a servant who would run before him or had a horse upon which to ride, then his personal deficiency is greater perhaps than my deficiency. I didn't have a servant or a horse to run in front of me. So if I fall from wealth, you don't have to raise me up to the level where I was. But if someone did have a horse and did have a servant to run in front of him, then actually that his starting level of wealth is higher, and we have to raise him up to that level of wealth, even though it might feel like well, I mean, that level of wealth is a servant to run in front of him. Are we really communally obligated? And they're suggesting yes. So there's a tension here that on the one hand, you just have to give to cover the deficiency. You don't have to make someone wealthy, right? That's not the goal of sort of like social services or support networks. But on the other hand, the Gemara is saying, but we actually take into account the level of wealth they had before they fell. And if someone was relatively well off, their deficiency, what they're accustomed to, might be greater. And so we have to raise them up. And so how do we know this? The Gemara tells a story. They said about Hillel the elder. Hillel the elder, one of the great rabbis of the at the turn of the 0 CE of the 1st century, in the time of the Second Temple. Hillel the rabbi, one of the great rabbis, great standing, he obtained for a poor person of noble descent, so someone who had fallen from stature, a horse upon which to ride and a servant to run in front of him. One time he did not find a servant to run in front of him, and Hillel himself ran in front of him for 3 mil to fulfill the dictate which is deficient for him. So here we have the story of Hillel the elder, the scholar, that there was someone who fell from wealth, and he made sure to provide him that which was deficient for him, including to the point of a servant to run in front of him, which feels like such an unnecessary thing to provide. And when one day he was not able to find the servant, then Hillel himself humbled himself to run in front of the poor, to run in front of the person, to make sure that he had what he needed. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I'm curious to hear questions about this text or responses about this text. What do you think about sort of the tensions in the text? On one hand, we're not required to make someone wealthy, but actually how far are we required to go that if someone fell from a higher standing, we would be required to raise them up to that standing? We would be required to provide them a horse, provide them, even if it means running in front of them ourselves as that in that servant role. So go ahead and share that in the chat. Okay, good. So Neil says, perhaps it has to do with helping people not to be ashamed by losing status. In other words, focusing on emotional needs. Interesting. I like that, Neil, a lot. That's saying it's not only that we're worrying about do people have enough money, but actually we're worried about the shame that they might feel, and that there might be other needs, that when people come before us and they're in need, there might be other things that we are tending to, not just their financial losses, but their emotional losses that we have to care for as well. Heather also says, saving face, not creating embarrassment like last week's lesson. I really appreciate that. Deb, I'm getting a couple of private messages. I'm assuming that those are meant to be read communally, because they're very good. I'd like to share them. I'm just reminding you, if you want them, the comments that I'll read out to the class, just reminding you not to message me privately, because then I'm not sure if you want them read out. So Deb says, the higher status doesn't ring true for me. If someone's needy and receives help, this means you aren't following Hashem's laws. So you should be grateful to Hashem for whatever you've received, sort of a take what I can get situation. Deb, I just wanted to really make sure to read your comment, because that's gonna come back in a later story that we're gonna read. So let's come back to that. Thank you. Right, and then Marcia also says, I think this is echoing Deb's message, are we not to consider the reason for their fall? So this goes into, and I think that this is very human, very normal. We're going to see this in some of the other texts. This goes into when we are the givers and we find ourselves in sort of in the position of power, it's automatic that there's a certain calculation that goes on in our head where we start saying like, well, what happened to them? Are they responsible? Are they responsible for their fall? Did they do something wrong? Should they have been helping themselves? Did they make a series of bad choices? Am I the one that's obligated to restore them? And how much do I actually have to give them? Okay, so they were wealthy before. I think at least on the surface of it, this text is saying we're just obligated to give, and we're obligated to give up to that level. But Marcia, I think that your question, and again, I think this goes to Deb's comment too, are we not to consider the reason for the fall? You're speaking to something very real, which is that we are always doing these inner calculations of judging, well, is this person worthy or not? Is this where I want to put my money or not? Is this where I want to put my time or not? And so we're going to come back to that comment. Okay, let's go. I'll just read Mimi's comment. The wealthier person's beginning level of need might start higher. I think, however, that we would prefer to help one with base unfulfilled needs. So maybe that's a really great question. Of course, it's not just one person in society we're helping. There's a lot of need in competing people. So is it actually that, say we have 10 people and they're all of different status and some of them would have required horses and servants, do we want to make sure baseline that everyone is raised up to some baseline before making sure that this guy has his horse and servant to run in front of him, but we still haven't actually met the basic needs of this person who has fallen from a lower status? So maybe I think that that's a really important and wise comment, that there might be different levels of need, and are there sort of base needs that we need to prioritize first before worrying about raising someone up to their status? So let's go on and we'll read a little bit more. A certain person came before Rabbi Nehemiah to request charity. He said to him, "On what do you normally dine? What do you normally eat?" This person requesting charity said to him, "I usually dine on fatty meat and aged wine." So presumably, this is someone who has fallen from higher status, had wealth, and what is the meal that he's accustomed to? It's these fancy, expensive things like fatty meat and aged wine. So Rabbi Nehemiah, it seems like in this story, is not a man of he has enough, but he's not a man of wealthy financial means. Rabbi Nehemiah says, "Is it your wish to belittle yourself with me and a meal of lentils?" Because that's what he eats. Rabbi Nehemiah doesn't eat fancy meat and the wine, he eats lentils. So the person in need had a meal with him of lentils and he died. What happens when this poor person comes before him and doesn't eat his fatty meat and his aged wine? He has some lentils and he dies from it. Rabbi Nehemiah says, "Woe to this one who was killed by Nehemiah." This is, if I could, I would block the rest of the text. I'm blocking the text with my hand, but you can't see that. I'd like to block the rest of the text. I just want you to pause there before you want to read the story. What does it mean? What does the Gemara mean what does Rabbi Nehemiah mean when he says, "Woe to this one who was killed by Nehemiah"? From Rabbi Nehemiah's perspective, who has done wrong in this story? Just take a look at the chat. Ah, interesting. Okay. Woe to this one who was killed by Nehemiah. Okay, so you're all saying it's the person who's asking for money who has done wrong. Okay, that's interesting. I think the Gemara is actually going to read it. Okay, good. Okay, Ari's saying he blames himself. Okay, so let's go back into the good that you're weighing in. So it's a little bit complicated. So let's see. I think here when Rabbi Nehemiah says, "Woe to the one who was killed by Nehemiah," woe to the one is like, who did the killing? He's blaming himself. He's saying, "I killed him." This woe to the one is like, this poor guy. This poor guy. He came to me. He told me that what he needs is fatty meat and wine, and I gave him lentils and I killed him. Woe to this guy. And that Rabbi Nehemiah here is taking responsibility and blaming himself for not feeding him the fatty, rich food to which this guy was accustomed. Woe to this one, this poor guy, I did wrong. And the Gemara says back to that, to Rabbi Nehemiah says, on the contrary, Rabbi Nehemiah should have said, "Woe to Nehemiah who killed this one." The Gemara flips it. What does woe to Nehemiah mean? That means poor Nehemiah who inadvertently was just trying to help this guy and share his lentils with him and now has to live with the fact that he killed someone. The Gemara turns around the blame, whereas initially Rabbi Nehemiah is taking the blame on himself and saying, "Oh, that poor guy, I killed him by not feeding him at the level that he was accustomed." The Gemara says, "No, forget that guy. We care about Nehemiah, poor Nehemiah, who was just trying to feed him lentils. He was sharing his food appropriately, and now he has to live with the guilt of killing him." It continues, rather, this is, the Steinsaltz helping us understand it. Rabbi Nehemiah should have said what he meant was that he, the pauper, should not have pampered himself so much. And so this text here, we're seeing a bit of a struggle, a bit of a tension here, whereas in this earlier text with Hillel, we're saying we have to raise someone up to the status they were, even if that means providing a horse, providing a servant to run in front of him, right? Presumably, even if that means giving them fatty meat and aged wine, if that's what they require. And then the Gemara is saying, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. Initially, Rabbi Nehemiah wanted to take the blame on himself and say, oh, I didn't provide him what he needed. I didn't provide him at the level that he was accustomed. And then the Gemara says, no, the problem is the poor person had pampered themselves so much that they became accustomed to this high level of eating, that then when they had these lentils, it was too much. And so there's a tension in the text of who's to blame here. Who's supposed to take responsibility? Is it the giver? Is it Rabbi Nehemiah supposed to take responsibility for making sure to support the poor person as they need? Or actually has the poor person, have they done something wrong? Are they to blame? Were they too spoiled, too needy, too pampered? And they're the one to blame. I'm going to read one more part of this story, and then I want to hear your thoughts on these two little sections together. So again, we're going to get a similar trope. A certain person came before Rava to request charity. So just like someone came before Rabbi Nehemiah, Rava said to him, on what do you normally dine? He said to him, on a fattened hen and aged wine. I don't think this is the same guy, but again, you see the theme of these people coming and asking for money, and yet they're accustomed to a very high level of eating. Rava says to him, were you not concerned that you were causing a burden to the community? So I think, Deb, this reminded me a little bit of your comment of like, here's this poor person. Shouldn't he just be okay with whatever he gets, right? Perhaps I'm not saying, but perhaps there's some sort of blame on, well, whatever happened, you're somehow responsible for, or you played a role in your fall, and now you're being supported by the community. Who are you to come and demand from the community a fattened hen and aged wine? You're placing too much of a burden on the community. You should be happy. You should take what you get. And so Rava, I think with a bit of judgment, says to him, sort of like the judgment that I think is in the end of this text here, who's this poor guy who's pampering himself, and so that when he doesn't get his fatty wine, he dies. So Rava says to him, were you not concerned that you were a burden to the community, right? You are burdening us. That's too much that you're asking for. The poor person says to him, is that to say that it is from their funds that I eat? I eat from the support of the merciful one. As we already learned that in the verse, the eyes of all wait for you, and you give them their food in its time, quoting from Psalms. So what is the poor person saying? Oh, it seems it's ki'ilu, it's as if I'm eating from the funds of the community, but that was never their money to begin with. Everyone's money actually belongs to God. When you're giving me food, it's not you that's giving me food. I'm actually getting my food from God. And so whereas Rava is perhaps with a bit of judgment, asking him, don't you think that by demanding such a high level of support, you are being a burden? This poor person responds back and says, I'm not eating from your hands. It's actually God that's supporting me. So don't come at me with your judgment. That the verse here, that give them their food in its time, at their time, is not stated, rather in its time. This teaches that the Holy One gives each and every one his sustenance at its proper time, that really when we are being supported, it's not coming through the community, it's actually coming through God. So if we were to just end the story here, it seems like, Rava was Rava was not just like, okay, well, let me go give you the fatty hen and wine. Rava was feeling, I'm not sure that that's an appropriate level of support to be asking for. And the poor person pushes back and says, no, I get my food from God. In the meantime, while they were talking, Rava's sister, who had not seen him for 13 years, came. And as a gift, she brought him a fattened hen and aged wine. What a strange coincidence. Here's this poor person who comes up sort of demanding or saying, this is what I'm accustomed to, a fattened hen and wine. Rava is not so quick to give it. A, he doesn't have it, but B, he comes back with a bit of judgment of, don't you think that's a bit much to be asking for? And then this fattened hen and wine just arrives as this poor person is standing there on the doorstep. So what is Rava going to do? Rava says to himself, what is this that happened before me? Rava said, I should have responded when you asked me, kum echol. I should have, when you asked me, Rabbi takes this as a sign. He says, when you initially asked me, or when I initially felt that I was being asked to provide the hen and wine, I came at you with judgment. You had your response. It's not clear how Rava feels about the response. Then when he gets this sign of the hen and wine suddenly arriving, what are the odds of that? He realizes, he takes it as a sign from God that actually all along he was obligated to provide this man with the food he was being asked for, that he's obligated to provide him with that level of sustenance, with the wine, with the food. He says, please come and eat. So you have these two stories back to back. I mean, first you have, if you're going back to Hillel, this tension of, on the one hand, providing that which is the deficit, that which is deficient, but up to the, even the fallen up status, which would seem to say, like, we do have to go above and beyond. And then we have these stories that I think have a little bit of a different endings. There's a tension here with this story ending on the one hand, Rabbi Nehemiah taking it upon himself. Oh, I should have been providing that higher level. And the Gemara saying, no, there's a judgment on the poor person. The poor person was too spoiled, was too pampered, had no right. Again, there's a tension in the second story of Rava having that judgment of it's too much. And the poor person actually holding and saying, no, this is my right. I'm getting it from God. And ultimately at the story, whereas this one seems to end with a sense of judgment on the poor person that they shouldn't have asked for that. This story seems to end with, I guess they were in the right because a sign from God comes, and ultimately Rava says, please come and eat. Okay, curious to hear your thoughts to those different stories, how you see them in tension with each other. What's coming up for you as you read these stories? So go ahead and let's turn to the chat. So Jeffrey says, we should ask for Archie Bunker. It's a long time that I heard that name, Archie Bunker. We should ask for Archie Bunker's opinion of the situation. How many movies have had this trope of the freeloading poor person who appears and how that person is treated? Right. I think that's part of what's going on here, is that there could be this perception of the freeloading poor person who's coming in and asking for, it's almost like a stereotype, asking for their fatty wine in hand. And the judgment that goes back to the theme of power, that the giver is then in the position of power of deciding, well, do I want to give you that or do I not want to give you that? In the second story or the third story, I think the poor person is saying, don't come at me with your judgment. I'm actually in the right to be asking for this. I'm not freeloading from you. This is actually something that God is giving me. Cindy says, when you ask for help, you should take what the giver is able to provide, regardless of your status. I think that's also interesting in these stories, that in both of these, I don't necessarily assume that the people who are in the position to give, in the first one, he didn't have the meal of hen and wine. What he had was lentils, and that should be enough, that we should be, as a giver, we are not always able to provide someone with that wealth. And so to feel then guilty about Rabbi Nehemiah, oh, woe to me that I killed him. He was doing what he could do. Rosa says, reminds me of the story that a poor person goes to the rabbi to ask for his daughter's hand in marriage. And the rabbis ask, how will you support your wife? And the young man answers, God will provide. Yeah, that's a beautiful connection, Rosa, to me. Neil says, it's not about the recipient, it's about the giver. I think that that's something that's very interesting about these stories. I think that's part of why I bring them is, I don't know if this is, speaking for myself, oftentimes, thank God, I'm blessed to be more in the position of the giver. And that, as I said, I think that is a position of power. And I think it's also a position of calculus of, whether we want to admit it or not, or aware of it or not, of making those sort of judgments of when you see someone asking for money, well, is this your fault? Did you do something? What are you going to use the money for? Are you the person that I should be giving to, or should I be giving something else? And so I think that the focus on these stories, that they're actually all about the giver, and the different rabbis in those moments wrestling with, well, should I give or should I not give? I think there's very powerful about seeing what happens when they're caught on the spot, when the person comes before them. How do they think through, or how do they make that decision? Okay, lots of really good comments. Rochelle says, this is interesting. The giver is asking what the pauper ordinarily dines on, then he fetches that it's too much to provide for the same. Yeah, that's interesting, Rochelle. What's the point of asking, what do you normally eat, if then they're not actually going to provide that? Or Rochelle, I think that that's a very interesting comment, right? It could have just said someone comes before them. The story is not that these people come before them and demand, I want my hen and wine. They come before them in need. Then someone asks them, what do you need? And then they say, and then they're like, well, that seems like too much. So Rochelle, that's very interesting, that if we're going to ask people what they need, well, then we have to be willing to actually provide that. And if you're not willing to provide that, then don't ask what they need, then just give them the bowl of lentils. That's an interesting comment. Deb says, are these people asking for help because they can eat lentils, but not enough for their regular meals? So Deb is saying, is it possible that they actually, and that feels really tricky, Deb, that is it that these people are not actually so deep in need that they don't actually have lentils to eat. They don't, that they do have their baseline being met, but what they're asking for help is that they still have experienced this drop in wealth. And then I think that's where the judgment comes in for sure, Deb, of, well, if you have enough to eat lentils, then why am I making sure that you can eat fatty hen and wine? I'm not sure, Deb. I think that you could be right about that. I think that that is a very possible read on the story. And then I want to go on and read the next text because I think that's going to relate to that. Yeah, I think it's possible to read these stories as that these people actually have a minimal amount of enough to eat, but they're still asking for help. And then the question is, well, where does judge, is that judgment, Rava comes in with the judgment, is that judgment appropriate or inappropriate? Do we get to say, well, you have enough, or if they're asking, are we obligated to give? Okay, there's a lot of other great comments. I'm not going to read all of them because I just want to see a little bit more text with you. So Maruka, this is just continuing on in Ketubot. As you could see, there's just a chain of these stories back to back. Maruka had another pauper in his neighborhood. There had been a previous story about Maruka that we didn't read. That's another great story. And then it goes on to another story about Maruka. Maruka had another pauper in his neighborhood, and Maruka was accustomed to send him 400 dinars, a certain amount of money, every year on the eve of Yom Kippur. One day he sent the money to him by the hand of his son. The son returned and said to him, this person that you're giving money to does not need the money. Maruka said, what did you see that made you say this? And the son says, I saw them spilling old wine for him. Here we would need the Rashi and we would need the Steinsaltz. What's the significance of the son seeing them spilling old wine on the ground for him? That they were wasting wine just to give the room a pleasant smell. That's how well off this guy is from the son's perception. It's not that he doesn't have any money to eat, that they actually had enough that they had old wine to perfume the room with. And the son sees this, right? This is equivalent to, the son sees that they have lentils to eat. The son sees, well, obviously they have enough if they have the ability to pour wine on the ground. And the son makes a judgment and says, they don't need this, Dad. Stop sending them money. They're not in need. And Maruka says, if he has pampered this much, that they need the perfumed wine on the ground, then he needs even more money. He doubled the funds and sent them to him. Here's a story of Maruka regularly is sending this guy money. The son goes and checks up and says, this person doesn't need money. They have sufficient for what they need, maybe even more than sufficient, right? They're dining on fatty hen and wine, or they're spilling wine on the ground. The son comes in with judgment and says, this person doesn't need more. And Maruka takes this as, oh, if that's how pampered they are, if that's the level to which they are accustomed, then I'm going to double my giving. Instead of Maruka saying, all along I've been giving money and what a total waste of money, Maruka amazingly takes it in the opposite direction and says, well, that's how much more obligated I am to them. Goes back to the story of Hillel, that if he couldn't find a servant to run in front of the guy, that Hillel would run in front of himself. I'm not necessarily, personally, I'm not necessarily weighing in on, is the son or Maruka right? Are we obligated to sort of give to sustain people at such a high level of wealth, even when they have the money to spill the wine on the ground? I don't necessarily want to weigh in the debate, but what I think is so compelling about these stories is that wrestling with judgment, that when we see people in need or in relationships with giving, the power to decide, am I going to give or not give to this person? And B, the judgment of it's so hard, it's so natural. And is it okay even? Maybe it's okay. I'm curious to ask you that. The judgment of, I'm judging whether or not the person needs my charity or doesn't need my charity. Here, the son is making that judgment. They don't need it. And the father is saying that that's not really for us to judge. Read on a little bit more. Again, Rabbi Hanina knew a certain pauper. You feel a similar tone. and was accustomed to send him 4 dinars every Shabbat Eve. One day he sent it in the hand of his wife. She came back home and said to him, the man does not need charity. A really similar story. Rabbi Hanina said to her, what did you see that prompted you to say this? She said to him, I heard them saying to him, the poor person inside the house, with what you normally dine, silver tablecloths or gold tablecloths. The implication being, not only does this person have enough food to eat, not only do they have a tablecloth on the table, the question is, should I use my silver tablecloth or my gold tablecloth? And so Rabbi Hanina's wife, when she actually sees the people that she's giving to, says, these people don't need our money. Why are we giving money to these people? They don't need it. What is Rabbi Hanina going to say? Rabbi Hanina said, this is what Rabbi Elazar said. Come and let us appreciate the swindlers, because were it not for them, we would be sinning every day. We're gonna have to go over this response again. Rabbi Hanina doesn't have the response of, I'm gonna double the money, but he's not disturbed by it. He's not disturbed. He doesn't say, what? I've been giving them money every year. They don't even need it. He said, that's okay. We actually need swindlers in the world. Thank God that there are swindlers. Thank God that there are people who are taking money from us that don't need it, because were it not for them, we'd be sinning every day in not actually doing our job of supporting the poor. As it said, beware that there be not a base thought in your heart saying the 7th year, this is quoting our passage, the 7th year of the year of release is at hand, and your eye be evil against your needy brother, and you will not give him, and he will cry out to the Lord against you, and it be sin in you. I think that the idea here is, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, of how do you understand what Rabbi Elazar is saying at the end here. I think the idea here is, thank God there are swindlers in the world who are asking for money or not, because if everyone actually legitimately needed money, if everyone that we pass on the street legitimately needed money, and we didn't give to them all the time, then we would be in real trouble. At least thank God that there are some swindlers, if occasionally we don't always do our duty and give to them, at least they're not sort of authentically crying out to God about us and we're getting in trouble. But actually Rabbi Elazar, rather than, or really here, Rabbi Hanina rather be indignant that he realizes perhaps that these people are swindlers who didn't need his money. He says, thank God for the swindlers, because then in all the other occasions where I didn't give, perhaps they were swindlers too, and that's okay, because I'm just doing my best here. Okay, I'm curious to hear, again, you see in this story, this tension between, are we in a position to judge people for, whether or not they are appropriate recipients of charity, or do we just give? Okay, curious to hear, we're just wrapping up here. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this story, or takeaways from what this series of stories in general, either what question you're leaving with or what you're taking from these stories today. So Heather says, perhaps why can't Maruka realize that a person's, Bar Ukba, the son, good. Why doesn't the son of Ukba realize that a person's situation might have changed? It's not that he's a swindler, but maybe before they needed the money and now they don't need the money, right? That's possible. Rita saying, perhaps he didn't spill the wine himself. Other people are spilling it. Perhaps they're spilling the wine not to, we were going sort of the Steinsalz there to perfume the room, but actually it's an insult to the poor person. Deb says, again, maybe the son caught them spilling out the wine because it had gone bad. Amazing. So you guys are not taking the Steinsalz, the sort of the translation, the interpretation at face value, and you're saying, actually, there might have been a number of reasons why the wine was being spilled. And what I love about your explanations here is how quick we are to jump to judgment. And, well, the fact that A was happening, it must mean B, and therefore they're not needy and don't deserve it. And you're saying there could have been a lot of good reasons why that was happening, and that doesn't necessarily reflect on their need, or it doesn't allow us to make an accurate assessment of their need. Both of you, all three of you, what you're really suggesting is to give people the benefit of the doubt. If they say that they are in need, to trust that and not to go in and say, oh, it must be they're not in need. Great. Heather says, it's better to give to too many than to give to too few people. Neil says, this passage is making the point that we can't always know each other's needs. We need to have faith to make it real charity. I love that, Neil. I think that that's so true, that what is the role of faith in justice goes, I think, back to Rabbi Hanina and the swindlers, is if we get into the business of judging everyone and trying to guess or decide, or, well, it looks like you're wearing those shoes, so you must not really need. We can't really do that. That we actually just have to, if someone says that they have need, that we have to just trust that. Thank you, Neil, for that. Arnold, if you're afraid to give because we may give to the wrong person, we will never give to the ones who are needy. That's great, Arnold. I feel like that's almost the inverse of Rabbi Elazar, that is like, well, it might be that you give to some people and some people are swindlers, and that's okay, according to Rabbi Chinan. It's like, that happens. And the inverse is, and if you just stop giving to people, then you're not actually giving, then you're going to be not giving to the people that actually need, that it has to work both ways. So thank you for that. There are more beautiful takeaways in here that I really appreciate. I encourage you, please, I'm sure you are, read all of each other's comments. Your takeaways are really important takeaways. This is amazing. I'm going to stop screen sharing here. And mainly, as I turn it back to Ari, I just want to thank you. I love, for me, I feel like the stories in the Gemara are in some ways, I feel like it's the heart of some of the learning that I love to do best. I love reading the stories. I love reading the stories about the rabbis and about everyday people just trying to get it right, sometimes getting it wrong, sometimes making mistakes. They're learning along the way, and we are learning with them. And sometimes for me, it's like the better, you could just read the halakha, you could just have the books tell you what to do. But actually, it's a bit more compelling to see people struggling with what to do and think about how does that reflect on our lives. So I really want to thank you for coming along on this journey together for the 4 sessions. It's always a pleasure learning with the CSB community. And let me turn it back to Ari.
Thank you. So yes, thank you for this series, another great one. I know we'll be taking a little hiatus, and hope to have you back teaching for CSP in the near future. So thank you, everybody, for your great participation. As usual, it's a great group, great insights, and great thoughts. I enjoy studying with all of you. And I know, we're heading to a point of potentially getting in person one day, which is always nice study, but we will always have online programs like this to give us a chance to study with people, not only who are our neighbors here in California, but around the country. So I thank you all for participating. I guess your mom didn't join us for this series, Avi, so maybe next series we'll invite her back as well. Thank you all for spending time with us. I wish you all a great, relaxing, long weekend, and look forward to seeing you back with CSP. Thank you all for supporting CSP, and I hope you'll support us in our new year. Take care, be well, be safe, and lots of adventures coming up in year 21 for CSP. Now to work. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks again, Avi.